The specialist sat across the desk from her and delivered his verdict in the careful, measured tone that doctors use when they want to say something serious without sounding alarming. The news was not good, and he knew it, and she knew it, and the room knew it. She had nodules on her vocal cords. They needed to come out. The surgery itself was routine. He had done it dozens of times. What came after the surgery was the part that required her full cooperation. She must not speak. Not a word, not a whisper. 6 weeks of complete vocal rest. Not a sound. She sat in that office and nodded and said that she understood, and the specialist had no particular reason to doubt her. She was 25 years old. She had a career to protect. She had every reason in the world to comply. What he did not yet know was that the thing she was about to do, the thing she was trying so hard to promise she wouldn't do, was going to make her more famous than any amount of careful recovery ever could have. By 1976, the name Bonnie Tyler was not yet famous in the way it would become. She had released Lost in France that year, a pleasant, radio-friendly record that had done well enough on the UK charts to prove she existed, without quite proving what she was capable of. The label was pleased. Radio was pleased. She was learning, patiently and without complaint, what it felt like to succeed at something that was only adjacent to what you actually wanted. The circuit that had made her, those smoky working men's clubs across South Wales, the Tuesday nights and the half-empty rooms and the crowds that eventually stopped talking when she opened her mouth, had given her a voice that was already unusual before the surgery. There was something in it that didn't quite fit the category of the music she was being asked to make, a roughness underneath the melody, a kind of weight in the lower register that other singers on similar material didn't carry. Producers noticed it. Engineers noticed it. Nobody was quite sure what to do with it. And then the nodules appeared. They arrived, as most of the important things in her life did, without announcement. A tightening in the throat, a persistent hoarseness that didn't resolve the way hoarseness usually did. The gradual realization that something in the instrument was wrong. She had been pushing her voice hard for years. The circuit demanded it. 3 sets a night in rooms where the acoustics worked against you and the crowd was not, by default, on your side. She had sung over noise and through exhaustion, and in venues that would have made a classically trained singer weep. The nodules were not a surprise to anyone who knew the life she'd been living. They were, in a sense, the accumulated cost of every hard-won room she had ever filled. The specialist explained that if she had the surgery and followed his instructions, she would recover fully. Her voice would return to what it had been. She could continue her career without significant interruption. The key, the non-negotiable part, was the silence afterward. 6 weeks, not a syllable. She went into the operating theater, and the surgery was completed, and she was told, when she came out of the anesthetic, that everything had gone exactly as planned. She lasted days. The silence was worse than she had anticipated. Not the physical discomfort, though that was present, the raw soreness of a throat that had just been worked on by someone with a scalpel, but the particular frustration of a woman whose entire professional life had been built around her voice, suddenly forbidden from using it. She communicated in writing. She gestured. She nodded and shook her head and pressed her lips together and counted the days. Robert was nearby, as he almost always was. He had learned, over the years of their marriage, to read her silences almost as well as her words, which was fortunate given the circumstances. He brought her tea. He sat with her. He did not make jokes about the irony of a singer being ordered to stop singing, though the irony was available to anyone who cared to reach for it. She kept a notepad beside her. When she wanted to say something, she wrote it down. Her handwriting, by later accounts, got increasingly emphatic as the days of silence accumulated. Words underlined, punctuation multiplied, the frustration of compression finding whatever outlet it could. The notepad was full by the end of the first week. The specialist had been clear. 6 weeks. Not 6 days, not 6 hours, 6 weeks. The vocal cords needed time to heal completely before any vibration was introduced. Even a whisper could disrupt the process. Even a laugh, if she wasn't careful, could undo what the surgery had done. She knew all of this. She had been told all of this. She had nodded her agreement in the office of a man who had no reason to doubt her. The days arranged themselves into a particular kind of torture that only people who live in their voices will fully understand. She would be in the middle of an ordinary moment. watching something on the television, sitting at the kitchen table while Robert read the paper, lying awake in the early hours. And a sentence would form, completely involuntarily, and she would get as far as opening her mouth before the instruction caught up with her. 6 weeks. She had agreed to 6 weeks. She made it through the first week. She made it through most of the second. She was not a woman who gave up on things she had committed to, and she did not give up on this, not technically, not deliberately. What happened was smaller than that, and in some ways larger. And then her brother was in hospital. The details of what put him there have always remained private. Her family was not a family that offered its difficulties to the public, and she was not a woman who would have wanted the story told that way. What is known is that she went to visit him. She brought something to take to his bedside, strawberries and cream, the kind of small, practical gesture of love that families in the valleys exchanged when someone was unwell. She sat with him. She wrote notes on her notepad. He recovered. It was on the way back to the car that it happened. She had reached the car park, or was approaching it, the specifics shifting slightly between retellings, when she realized she had left the strawberries and cream behind. Not at home, at his bedside. She had carried them all the way to the hospital, and then, in the effort of managing a visit conducted entirely in writing, she had simply left them there. It was the kind of small, ordinary failure that lands differently when you are already exhausted and already frustrated and already holding more constraint inside yourself than feels sustainable. She opened her mouth. Oh no, 2 words. Perhaps a little louder than 2 words. Perhaps something closer to the kind of sound that comes from a person who has been holding everything in for too long and has just run out of the space to hold it. The hospital car park did not record the moment. No one else appears to have been close enough to hear it. The only witness was the air in South Wales on an unremarkable afternoon, and whatever physical process those 2 syllables set in motion inside a pair of vocal cords that had not yet finished healing. She did not immediately understand what she had done. She drove home. She made tea. She told herself it had probably been fine. 2 small words, barely anything, and her throat did not feel any worse than it had before. She told herself this with the particular conviction of someone who wants very badly to believe something and has just enough uncertainty to keep the belief alive. The return visit to the specialist would settle the question in a direction she had not entirely prepared herself for. When she returned to the specialist, the examination was thorough and his expression was not quite what she had hoped for. He looked at her throat with the careful attention of a man reading results he had not quite expected. And then he sat back, and he said something she would repeat for the rest of her life. You've really gone and done it now. You're going to be more husky. She sat with those words the way she sat with most things that mattered, quietly, turning them over, testing what they meant. More husky. The nodules were gone, as the surgery had intended. But the vocal cords had healed differently than they would have if she had followed the instructions. Something in the tissue had altered the character of the instrument in a way that no subsequent treatment was going to reverse. The voice she would have from this point forward was not the voice she had gone into the operating theater with. It was not, as things turned out, a lesser voice. It was simply a completely different one. Robert was waiting when she got home. She wrote down what the specialist had said, not the medical terminology, just the key sentence. More husky. He read it. He looked at her. He said, in the matter-of-fact way that was his instinct for most things, that husky might suit her. It was not a particularly profound observation. It was the kind of thing a husband says when he does not know quite what else to say and does not want to make the situation larger than it needs to be. But she kept it, the way she kept most of Robert's observations, not because they were complicated, but because they were steady, and steady was what the situation required. She did not know yet what the new voice was going to sound like on record. She did not know whether the industry that had been carefully steering her toward radio-friendly country pop would know what to do with a singer whose instrument had just changed in a way nobody had planned for. She did not know whether the labels would hear it as damage or as something more interesting than damage. The uncertainty settled over the household the way uncertainty does when there are no good answers yet available and nothing to do but wait for the throat to heal and find out. She would not have to wait long to find out. And what she found would surprise everyone in the room. When she walked into the recording studio for the first time with the new voice, the reaction was not what she had prepared herself for. She had prepared herself for concern, for careful words about whether the change was permanent, about whether they should wait and see, about contingency plans and alternative approaches, and the particular excruciating politeness of music industry professionals trying not to tell a singer that her instrument sounds different in a way that might be a problem. What she got instead was silence of a different kind. The kind that falls over a room when something has happened that nobody expected, and nobody has the vocabulary for yet. "Bloody hell," someone said. "Where's that come from?" It was not a verdict. It was more like an instinctive response to something surprising. The way people speak when they have not had time to think about what they are going to say. But it was also, she would later reflect, precisely the reaction that told her something important. Nobody in that studio had heard anything quite like it before. And in the music industry, that is either the worst possible thing or the best possible thing, with very little in between. The session continued, and gradually, over the course of that afternoon, the room stopped being surprised and started paying attention in a different way entirely. The rough-edged quality that the surgery had left behind did not disappear under the studio lights. It sat at the center of every note she produced like a dark thread woven through the sound. And the more they recorded, the more apparent it became that the thread was not a flaw. It was the thing that made the whole cloth worth looking at. She had come in expecting to explain herself. She left with something she had not arrived with. A voice that nobody in the industry had heard before. "It's a Heartache" was recorded not long after. A song that would go on to climb to number 3 on the American Billboard Hot 100 and number 4 in the United Kingdom, selling in numbers that nobody, including Bonnie Tyler, had entirely predicted. It was an international breakthrough of a kind that most singers spend entire careers chasing. The kind where you hear yourself on the radio in a country you have never visited, and the feeling is so large and so strange that it takes time to understand it as good news rather than simply as news. She was in America for the first time when the scale of it fully arrived. Tour buses and hotel lobbies and radio stations whose call signs she could not pronounce, all of them playing the voice that a Welsh specialist had told her she had gone and done now. She sat in the back of tour buses eating crisps she had brought from home, and listened to her own voice coming out of American speakers, and felt something she would later struggle to describe precisely. Not quite pride, not quite disbelief, something in between those two things that does not have a clean name in English or Welsh, and it was made with a voice she was not supposed to have. What the specialist had called damage, the world called something else entirely. She spoke about the surgery openly in the years that followed. It was not a secret she kept, partly because it was genuinely too strange a story to suppress, and partly because she was not, by temperament, a woman who spent much energy managing other people's perceptions of her. She told it the way she told most things, directly, with a certain amount of Welsh black humor, without drama. She had been told not to speak. She had spoken. She had ruined her voice. She had become famous on the strength of it. The logic of the thing was, she acknowledged, not entirely logical. What she did not often say was that the voice she had before the surgery, though perfectly good, had been a voice of a particular kind. Pleasant, professional, capable of doing exactly what the label was asking it to do. Adequate, in all the ways that mattered to the people writing the contracts. The voice that came out of the other side of that hospital visit was not adequate. It was extraordinary. It was the kind of voice that stops a room, that makes engineers put down their coffee, that makes producers sit up straighter and reconsider everything they thought they were going to do with a session. It was the kind of voice that, 7 years later, Jim Steinman would hear on a cassette tape in New York and decide was the only voice in the world for the song he had been carrying since he was a teenager. The specialist had told her she had really gone and done it now. He had, without quite meaning to, said the truest thing anyone would ever say about what happened that day. There is a version of this story that treats the whole thing as an accident, a medical misadventure, a moment of frustrated impatience in a hospital car park, a voice that changed by chance rather than by design. It is not a wrong version, but it leaves something out. The voice that was altered by that moment in 1976 had been built, over years, in the hardest possible way. Pub stages and working men's clubs and backing singer sets and talent contests entered on her behalf by aunts who believed in her before she fully believed in herself. The surgery happened to a voice that had already been formed by everything that came before it. The accidental addition of that extra layer of texture landed on an instrument that already knew how to use it. Robert Sullivan, who had been there for the building of it, never made a large thing of his part in any of it. He had told her, the night she came home from the specialist's office with a notepad full of words she had not been allowed to say out loud, that husky might suit her. He had been right about that. More right than either of them could have known at the time. She went on to sing that changed voice on stages around the world, for decades, to rooms that had no idea they were hearing the consequence of a forgotten punnet of strawberries and cream. She sang it until it became the most recognizable thing about her. She sang it into one of the most famous recordings in the history of popular music. And every time someone asked her how her voice had come to sound the way it did, she told them, directly, without embellishment, with a slight smile that knew exactly how strange the story was going to sound. She had been told not to make a sound. She had made one anyway. And the world, as it turned out, was very glad she did. She had been Gaynor Hopkins when she married Robert Sullivan. She had been Shireen Davis on the South Wales Club stage. She was Bonnie Tyler to the world, a name built out of sound she liked, worn over an identity built out of years of work nobody had been counting. And through all of it, through every version of the name and the stage and the voice, she had been the same woman, a coal miner's daughter from Skewen who had understood, from the first time she opened her mouth in a room that was not ready for her, that the only correct response to a difficult room was to sing until it listened. The voice that came out of 1976 had not been planned. The life that built toward it had. Every unremarkable Tuesday in every half-empty club, every backing vocalist set behind someone else's spotlight, every patient year between the voice that had been adequate and the accident that made it extraordinary. Accidents do not happen in a vacuum. They happen to people who are ready for what they bring. There is also something worth saying about the specialist himself, the man who delivered the news, who looked at her healing throat and told her she had really gone and done it now. He was not wrong about the medical reality. The vocal cords had changed. The voice was different. What the instrument produced from that point forward was not what it had produced before. All of that was true. What he could not have known, what nobody standing in a South Wales clinic in 1976 could have known, was the chain of events that his 11 words would eventually set in motion. The roughness he described as a consequence would become, within a year, the quality that made her voice unmistakable on international radio. The huskiness he noted as a change would become, within 7 years, the sound that a Broadway-trained composer in New York would call the only voice in the world for the song of his career. The damage he measured would become, in the decades that followed, the thing by which an entire generation recognized her before she had sung a full bar. She never, as far as anyone knows, went back to that clinic to tell him. She told the story instead, in interviews and documentaries and on television programs and backstage after concerts, to journalists and fans and anyone who asked how her voice had come to sound the way it did. She told it with a smile that had been refined over 50 years into something close to perfect, the particular expression of a woman who knows that the best stories are the ones that shouldn't have worked out and did. The world has a word for what happened to her voice in 1976. That word is not damage. The word is luck, of the very specific kind that only arrives when you have already done everything else. It is a satisfying word, luck. It asks nothing of the person it lands on. It requires no prior investment, no accumulated patience, no years of unremarkable Tuesdays in clubs that were not ready for you. It simply happens, to anyone, at random, and the outcome is the outcome. That is not what happened to Bonnie Tyler. What happened to her was earned, every step of the way, long before the accident in the car park gave it a shape the world could recognize.